everyone. So nice to see so many faces that I'm here in the morning. So, as the introduction suggested, I'm going to first take us to Mexico. And when I began this research project that I'm going to talk about, I was really interested in understanding how one of Mexico's most important companies was adapting to the global changes of the opening of the Mexican economy and what that meant for the workers. And so the company that I studied is located in Monterrey, which is in the north, about a couple hours south of the Texas border. It originated as a beer company in the late 1800s, but today it's one of Mexico's most premier beverage corporations. And so they also produce beer, but they produce juice and soda as well. They have about 3,000 workers at their Monterrey facility. I'm going to call the company BevMax in the spirit of trying to disguise the company that I studied, although it'll probably be apparent by the end. The data that I'm going to present today is based on 2.5 years of field work. Before I came to Wayne State, I had lived in Mexico for some time. I spent about 2.5 years at this company interviewing 86 employees. 40% of them are women, participant observation at several company events, and review of the company magazine. So early on in my field work, as I started talking to the workers, I heard very contradictory statements about the role of women in the company. And so, for example, one of the first things, Katia was one of my key informants into the company, and she said to me, in many ways, we are more progressive. Women voted our company elections in 1918 before they did nationally in 1953. But in contrast, Monica, who's a supervisor, says it was an understood policy. If you were to work here, at the moment you married, you had to leave the company. So these two very contrasting opinions about the position of women at the company led me to wonder, well, what do workers think about the role of women at BevMax, and how is it changing over time? So as Monica suggests, there was a known policy. It wasn't a written policy, but it was something that was known. It was an informal practice that BevMax did. And so what happened was all women, regardless of the position that they occupied in the company, had to leave upon marriage or pregnancy. It changed in 1983 for professional women. They could continue working after marriage, and then a decade later in 1993 it changed and they could continue working after pregnancy. It wasn't until 1997 that all women, regardless of the position they had in the company, could continue working. At first glance, it sounds like this can't possibly be happening, but it also happened in a lot of U.S. companies as well and other corporations around the world. It's just, I think what's surprising is the date. It's not until 1997 that women were eventually able to continue working. So in 1997, that meant secretaries and line workers could also keep their job. So today what I'm going to talk about is what workers think about this policy and what it meant for them once it changed. And so I'm going to talk about these gendered discourses of work, and when I talk about gendered discourses of work, what I'm talking about is the ideas and practices about men and women providing distinct forms of labor and how they play a critical role in workers' perceptions and experiences in the workplace, and then how it changes over time. So when I first met Pamela, I was interested in understanding a little bit more about the work culture at BevMax. And so when I asked her about this work policy, she said to me, before the policy changed, I think most people thought it was more important to give work to men rather than women. So there were certain differences with salaries, the housing benefit, and with everything. They said it was men that should work and that women should be at home with the children. A woman should not take the place of men at the company. So as Pamela is explaining, BevMax promotes a very traditional view of women in the workplace. And this has resulted in a rigid gender division of labor. So women were mostly relegated to positions as secretaries, as receptionists, and early on as line workers, where men were promoted into positions of management decision-making. And so BevMax was able to maintain this rigid gender division of labor in part because of that marriage and pregnancy policy. Right? By funneling women out, phasing them out of their jobs as soon as they got married, it was very difficult for them to move up the corporate ladder. So when I asked workers why the policy changed, what was significant about 1997, what was happening, workers across the board all talked about Mexican economy opening, management at the corporation implementing strategies to confront the demands of a global economy, and with that came new ideas. So managers talked about reorienting their workforce to a global rights of women to work. They talked about how the company had been very conservative, but now with modernity they needed to change. Workers talked about needing to update new ideas. new ways of thinking that were coming into the company. But ultimately what this did is it put management in a quandary to figure out, well, how are they going to now incorporate women more fully into the workplace? And so one of the managers that I spoke with, Eduardo, he really talked about trying to figure out how management was going to deal with the fact that many women wanted to continue working. So he says to me, the decision to allow married or pregnant women to work at the company was significant because it gave parity between men and women, but with the blessing that women could still have a family. But women still have to show they are responsible in their work. The problem before was, how am I, the company, going to help a woman fulfill her mission or her profession? Before, the woman thought, am I going to prepare to be a housewife and mom, or am I going to prepare to be a secretary? Now the majority of women want a professional career, and this is changing things at the company, and we've had to respond. So what Eduardo is suggesting here is, before women were thought of as working women, and then now they're thought of as working women and working mothers. So how is the company going to deal with both of these positions and try to help women adjust to working and also being a mom? So, what did this mean for the workers? I'm going to first talk about administrative assistants, and then I'm going to move on to some women who are higher up in the hierarchy, and then I'm going to move on and talk about the factory workers, which was very different for the women. They have a very different trajectory. So some of the women that I spoke to, so for example, Lorley says, when I first started, there were many young women that did not marry, because the policy did not permit you to marry. If you did, it was adios. Now we are married, we have kids, a husband, and we work. This is great because they let us grow and develop, and they continue to give us benefits. It's more. There are women working here that are not just secretaries. Now there are many professional women as well, and women participate in the company cooperative council. Really, we have won a lot. Other workers also talked about the significance of being able to hire women in positions that typically they would have been hired for before. So for example, Augustine is a supervisor, and he says the convention is changing. There are more women than men in medicine. In the future, there will be no other option. You hire a woman doctor, or you hire a woman doctor. Now I had indicated at the beginning that this is a beverage corporation, so why would we be hiring doctors? In the 1920s, Bevmex was considered probably Mexico's most progressive company. In the 1920s, they gave all their workers free health care. It started out as a voucher system, it expanded to a clinic, and in 1989, they built a full-scale on-site hospital. So that's why he's talking about hiring women as doctors. So Orietta, an administrative assistant, says, well, now women have the opportunity to develop professionally. I want to move ahead and focus on my career. I just completed my bachelor's degree, and this has meant that I'm not stuck as a receptionist. Now, not all women felt that there were opportunities. Some of the women that I spoke to felt that there were real obstacles. So for example, Carmen, today there are 4 top women out of 220 top men, and all of them, with the exception of one, is husbandless and childless. There is respect for the women that have sacrificed their own personal life to get far. The company has advanced, but there are not necessarily more women in roles of authority and leadership positions. What I think is it does not take a great woman manager to get to the top, but a woman who works like a dog and sacrifices her life to get to the top. So Carmen is really saying that women can only move up if they exhibit masculine characteristics, typically associated with certain professions such as management. So they should be unencumbered by familiar responsibilities, they should be able to work long hours at the drop of the hat, and they should be committed to the company. So some of the women that I spoke to talked about having to face issues of credibility. So Veronica said credibility was very difficult. She was the first woman in management. She was not the first woman in management, but the first one that was young. And she felt really observed and studied to see if she could do it. After about a year, she says, I was married and became a mom. That year was difficult. I really felt observed by the entire world. I think people were watching, can she do it? Can't she do it? Would I resist? Would I quit? After a while, people asked me, well, how do you do it? But later they began to ask if I was going to have another baby. When I finally said no, I felt the pressure lifting again. Others talked about having to show they could do it. And so in our conversations, they really felt that they had to work twice as hard as the men to be able to demonstrate that they in fact can do it. So for example, Irala says, slowly over time we have demonstrated that work does not have sex. If the person is capable, they can develop professionally. I think that if a woman shows results and that she can dominate the position, her male co-workers will start to open their minds and the work environment is more open. So what Irala is talking about is that women have to have a certain set of skills, and if they have those set of skills and they can really show they can do it, then they can move ahead. This was echoed in all of my interviews with management. And so Raul, who's one of the top managers, I think he's number 3 in the company, spoke a lot about the skills and the importance of women having certain skills to be able to compete. And so he says, a woman executive or director is just like a man. I believe that responsibility, professionalism, and institutionalism should be equal. The policy change has been that there is the option to hire the best talent, whether it is male or female. The other change is that we now have a transformation that includes everyone. For women, it means married, single moms, women in top executive levels. There is no limitation if women work and develop themselves. Then tomorrow there'll be more women here. I think in terms of overall competence, talented women should have the same opportunity as talented men. So for Raul, the policy change now means that there is a greater pool with which they can actually hire workers if they have the skills and the knowledge and the talent to do so. But in his characterization of this new workplace, there's no discussion of the different obstacles that women and men face, but rather suggests that the policy change has leveled the playing field for women to that of men. And now the burden is on women to gain the right skills and knowledge to be able to move ahead. So that's a little bit about women in lower administrative positions and women that are trying to move up the corporate ladder. What I want to do now is just speak a minute about women in the factory. Carlos was a manager that I spoke with in the factory, and they have 3 production facilities, one in beer, one in bottling, and the other one in labeling. And so Carlos says, as technology advanced, it replaced women in the factory that fit with management's philosophy. It is the idiosyncrasy of the company that limited women's participation. So Mariana tells me they fired them when the lamina bottling section closed. They did not move the women to other sections because there were mostly men in those departments. Now there are only 2. Similarly, Edna says they, management, decided to only work with men because an integrated workforce could provoke possibilities of tension and struggle between the men and the women. Before 1989, it was mostly women in my area and few men. In the case of this particular company, before World War II, the vast majority of the line workers were all women. It was detail-oriented, it was low-skill positions, and it was mostly women. After World War II, in the beer production facility, as women phased out because they got married, they were replaced by men. So that women were not hired to replace them. So by the time of my field work, there were no women in the beer production facility. In the case of the labeling and the bottling division, that was much lower. So women were still phased out as they were married, but they could still be replaced by a woman. What happened to them was when the new technology kicked in. So when the new technology came in the late 1980s, those jobs were redefined as masculine jobs. They were defined as jobs for men because they required technology and skills, and they were much higher skilled than the type of work that women were doing before. So when I left my field work, there were 2 women in the bottling production facility, and there were 6 in labeling, and then of course none in the beer production. So that's a very different experience that the line workers had than the administrative women. Okay, so now that the company has changed, we have this new policy in 1997, but women don't seem to really be moving up the corporate ladder, right? We've got 4 out of 220. I was interested to understand how management was explaining this, what was going on. So Javier is a coordinator, and he says top management says that women don't want to work. Management does not see that women are committed to the company like men are. For them, it is easier and faster when just men are involved. And Renato says women don't ask for an opportunity in these areas. So what Javier and Renato are suggesting is that women themselves create the barriers. They don't want to work. They're not committed to the company, right? Or, as Jaime tells me, they lack professionalism. And so he talks to me about the experience that he's had recently with 2 of his secretaries leaving. So he says, my last 2 secretaries were pregnant. So what I'm seeing is that on the one hand, we have to educate women, make them more professional and understand responsibility. Everyone has the right to make their decisions that come with consequences. Just because you are a mom, I'm not going to let you leave work early. If you can, you're finished for the day, okay, but if not, I think we have to achieve better balance in Mexico because women lack the spirit of professionalism that we see in the U.S. For example, where women are better able to organize their life. Obviously, I was from the U.S. at the time. That very much was a comment directed at me as being a working woman from the United States. But in our conversation, he definitely talked about very real obstacles in Mexico. And there are very real structural obstacles that make it difficult for women to work in Mexico once they have children. And so as he continues, he talks about those obstacles, but then he manages to turn it around and really saves the women. So on the other hand, he says, Mexico has to organize itself to assist mothers. School ends at 2 p.m., and there are few schools that stay open until 5. This complicates the life of a woman to become professional and be able to say, I can stay. I have nothing that is getting in my way. What does a woman do if she does not have her mom or sister to help her? Suddenly you think that Mexican society lacks the tools to prepare women. But then in the next sentence, he says, but it's also the women. Right? We cannot see women as the only victims and not the company. Sometimes the boss is a victim because sometimes he has to stay to do work, secretarial work. That does not correspond to him and stay late. Why? If both have the same rights to free time, family, and responsibilities, I think there is equality of opportunities, but we have to start balancing it out better. All right, so what does all this mean? Based on what I found after speaking to the different workers at BevMax and all the different positions in the hierarchy, the policy can change, but if there's not a corresponding cultural, the work organizational culture change, it's going to reproduce those same persistent gender job allocation. So, for example, the women who were in low administrative positions saw no obstacles. And it was, through all my interviews, I was very, very surprised. They all spoke about opportunities. But I would suggest that simply because that's where they're supposed to be. Right? They're in feminine-type jobs in low-level administrative positions as administrative assistants, as assistant coordinators, and so there's not a high skill that's required for those jobs. In the case of the women in the maquilas, what is so interesting is, I'm sure many of you know, the maquilas in Mexico hire predominantly women. It's about 90% of the labor force in the maquilas are women because they're low-skilled positions. Right? But in the case of BevMax, as soon as the new technology is introduced, those jobs are relabeled as masculine jobs, so they're intended for men. For women in high administrative positions, they perceive a glass ceiling because they must show they can do it. They need to have very masculine characteristics to move up that corporate ladder. Now, Augustine did tell us that they are hiring women as doctors, and that all the nurses, with the exception of one, are women. But in those cases, and they are considered higher in the organizational hierarchy, but in those cases, they're still in appropriate positions because they're caregivers. They're working in the hospital. They're not working in the ideas and the intellectual side of the corporation. So what I'm arguing in this paper is that when management's discourse identifies women as a problem in the workplace, they're really saying that women need to embody masculine characteristics. So again, they need to work long hours, they need to sacrifice, they need to not be encumbered by a family, and they need to be committed. So their primary identity has to be a work identity. So in that process, they're problematizing women's relationship to the domestic sphere, right? And if women don't move up, then they lack professionalism. So these gender discourses, these ideas of what men and women should do in the company, end up portraying women as caregivers, men as breadwinners, and it ends up constraining them both. So for women, right, they're either working women or they're working mothers. And if you're working mothers, then your primary identity is being a mom. And there's no expectation that you're ever going to be committed to the company. And for men, you automatically have to have that primary identity of association with work. So there's no room or no opportunity for men to be working dads. So to be sure, there are definitely structural limitations in Mexico. If you're not in a higher socioeconomic bracket, it's very expensive childcare. And so you don't have an option. You have to leave your job once you decide to have children. And so ultimately, I'm arguing that there is a reproduction of feminine and masculine workers that reaffirms a gendered workplace. Thank you. So I'll look forward to your comments and questions.
have about 5 minutes for questions.
Yes.
So please.
Or comments.
Or suggestions, as I work through this.
For vocal performance.
You're so quiet in the morning.
Krista, where does this research, I mean, I as the director shouldn't ask the first question, but nobody else is. Where is this research? I mean, you did the field research. Are you still working with that? Are you going to pick that up at some time again in that company, or is that research?
Is it just going to come to an end and
And
that's
you will
it?
move to another something else?
Ideally, what I would like to do is go back sometime in the next couple of years, and I want to follow the women in particular. Right, there were 34 women out of the 86 that I interviewed. I'm really curious to find out how many are still working at the company.
And what they moved?
And have they moved up, or have they moved on? What's happened? So I definitely want to go back and continue this as sort of a follow-up study and find out what happened to the men.
Absolutely.
You know, the contacts that I still have there, some of them definitely have moved around because there's been some restructuring in the past year. But I understand, I think almost all of the women are still there with the exception of 2.
And then the question of what globalism does to these companies in terms of restructuring and dealing with those issues as well. I mean, I think that impacts.
Well, what's fascinating about this company is they were able to restructure. They lost half of their production workforce, the labor. So the factory workers, it was a slow, throughout the whole 1980s, there was a slow reduction of the labor, but they've been able to keep all their benefits. They have the most amazing benefits than any other company. Free healthcare, free daycare facility now.
But for the folks who are left, not for the folks they severed.
Well, the people that left lost their job, yes.
Okay.
The people that have been able to stay have really good benefits. Yeah. There were 2 hands I saw over there.
I forgot the specific year that you stated, but in the 80s, when women in Europe were allowed to stay after they were married.
In 1983, but the women that were labeled as professional
Yeah,
jobs.
but prior to that, 100% of women who worked there were single and child-free.
Yes.
And then, how is it that, and I know it was an unwritten rule that once you were married or pregnant, you left the company, was it women resigned and quit, or were they fired?
They just knew, so they resigned and quit. Yeah. And this was not a practice that was standard across all of Mexico. It was very exclusive. There certainly were cultural pressures and expectations that once you married, that you would dedicate yourself to being a housewife. But there's a set of companies, and BevMex is one of them. There was about 10 of them in the 1980s that had this policy, but because they were some of the best companies in the country in terms of benefits, women were willing to stay there and sacrifice and decide to choose work over family. But it was very much an informal policy that was just known.
I noticed that in the abstract convention, the companies adjusting to NAFTA. And I wondered in your data whether there were any themes of nation, were changes in policies seen as responding to NAFTA or American pressure, were arguments about, situations in their evolution ever made in terms of Mexico?
Great question. In the north, it's very conservative, very, very conservative. In many ways, Monterrey is like being in Houston. And so there's always been a very, very close relationship of the businessmen in Monterrey with the United States. So when NAFTA took place, there were no protests in Monterrey. The workers were very excited because they saw they were finally going to be accepted into the global economy. Had I done this study in Mexico City, it would have been very different. Right? But people in the north, for the most part, very much, they want to be the United States. And so it's not that all, but I mean, generally speaking, in the city itself, there is a very close attachment to the United States. A lot of people's family live there. Kids, parents who can afford it send their kids to Texas. And so it's a much closer relationship than with Mexico City, which would be a completely different ballgame. And so when they talked about NAFTA, they talked about being excited about the new technology. Many of them were sent over to Europe for training. There were the lean production techniques that were brought in. So they didn't have, it was teamwork, right, the Japanese style, instead of having this hierarchy. So it meant they had a lot more responsibility than they ever had before. So again, going back to what, it's the ones that lost their job, but the ones that were able to stay really felt like the workplace had improved for them. which is very contradictory than what
And
most
then-
research talks about.
How is that regarded in, say, Mexico City? How, do you have any?
I don't have any data
for
from Mexico City.
Or was?
Yeah, all my research was in Monterrey. And in the case of Mexico City, that's where their Coca-Cola distribution is. They're the largest distributors of Coca-Cola in Latin America, and that's all run out of Mexico City. Right, which is slightly different. There are more women higher up in the Coca-Cola division. Other questions, comments? Okay, well, thank you very much.